having ourselves a vigil here today, a picket line, a press conference outside of the Federal Building in Chicago. We're gathered here today because on tomorrow, the United Nations will be voting once again about the United States blockade of Cuba. For the last several years, the United Nations has voted to condemn the United States and call on them to end the blockade of Cuba. They're going to vote again tomorrow. Every year, the results are the same. The entire world community is in opposition to the United States economic sanctions and blockade of Cuba. So we gather today to say, Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. Cuba sí, bloqueo no. We have several speakers lined up today to give us some more insight into the situation with Cuba. Our first speaker is Anthony Quezada. He's the Cook County Commissioner from the 8th District here in Chicago, and he's been one of the leaders on the transition team for Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson. So, Anthony?
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, comrades and siblings. Before I get started, I want to ask us to take a moment of silence for our siblings who are under siege in Palestine. Thank you. I want to thank the coalition for inviting me out today to talk on this issue. Again, my name is Anthony Joel Quezada. I'm the Cook County Commissioner on the northwest side of Chicago. And I'm here to proudly say that we must end the blockade against Cuba, and we also must take Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism list. It is an international embarrassment that the United States has maintained this horrible and inhumane policy against the Cuban people and its society. I had the great honor of joining an international delegation last week, and I visited Havana, and I talked to the Cuban people. I visited their clinics, we went to their hospitals, we visited their schools and their neighborhoods and their nationally elected officials. And what is understood amongst all Cuban people is they want to see an end to this inhumane blockade, and they want to build relationships and international solidarity with the people of the United States. They stand with us, and we must stand with them. The Cuban society has done so much in regards to healthcare, in prioritizing the needs of people. Their most fundamental principle, when I spoke with all of their institutions, was the principle of human solidarity. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? A government that actually puts the needs of people over profits. What a radical idea. When I met with their government officials, I told them about the inhumane policies that are enacted here, just within the city of Chicago, where we've had neoliberal mayors shut down our schools, shut down our clinics. And yet, despite such a horrible blockade against the Cuban people, their government has never thought twice to close their clinics, has never thought twice to close their schools, has never thought twice to displace their working class residents. There is an over 95% home ownership rate in Cuba, while we have over 60,000 people who are homeless in the streets of Chicago. What a shame. What a deep shame. So there are people who told me, Anthony, when you go to Cuba, let them know that they have so much to learn from us. And I say, no, we have so much to learn from them. And it is a tragedy that we have imposed this blockade, that the government of the United States has imposed this blockade, not only against the people of Cuba, but against our own people. There are so many routes and avenues for collaboration when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to housing, when it comes to environmentalism, when it comes to science, that we can learn and collaborate with the Cuban people. But our United States government does not want us to see the success of a nation that puts people over profits. So I stand here today and I call on our senators and our U.S. congressmen, and I call on our president to finally put an end to this inhumane blockade against the Cuban people, to take them off the state sponsor of terrorism list, because they are state sponsors of peace. They're state sponsors of international solidarity, and we have so much to learn from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. Our next speaker is Danica Kanovich. She's co-director of Code Pink. She's based here in Chicago, and we're proud to have her here today. As Code Pink proved yesterday, they're one of the moral conscience of the United States. So, Danica.
Thank you all for having me. I actually got the privilege of also traveling to Cuba in 2022 to learn about the impacts of the U.S. blockade. And a justification that I hear over and over again from political elites in the United States is that the blockade is imposed because Cuba isn't a democracy. They don't have democracy in Cuba. But when I was in Cuba, something interesting happened. I was sitting at dinner with my Cuban hosts when I found out that Roe versus Wade was being overturned in the United States. While I was in a country that not only gives people the right to an abortion, but a free abortion on demand whenever they need it. So in the U.S., a handful of people that I didn't elect, that were appointed by a president I did not have the right to vote for because of my age, threw out my right to an abortion because they could. Because our democracy doesn't require our consent to revoke our rights, and our political system doesn't ask what we want or consult us in our own futures. So our leaders do not actually care, they're not actually concerned about democracy here or in Cuba. The explicit intent of the blockade is to crush the Cuban economic and political system. Leaked, official, U.S. documents have proved that to be true. There's no more denying the fact that after 60 years it hasn't worked, so the U.S. doubles down and places Cuba on the state sponsor of terrorism list, and the result is more human suffering. Cubans deserve the right to chart their own course, to build their own future, and to decide their own political and economic structures. And it has been disgusting to watch local, state, and national leaders roll their eyes at the migrant crisis in the city of Chicago when they haven't done a single thing to call out the sanctions that are causing so many people to leave Latin America in the first place. The United Nations votes overwhelmingly against the blockade of Cuba every single year. The world does not support economic warfare on the people of Cuba. While the blockade hasn't been successful in its explicit goals to overthrow the Cuban government, it makes life in Cuba very difficult. Any leader pretending to care about the Cuban people that also supports the economic policy that causes their suffering is lying to protect their own political ideology. The people of Cuba are the ones suffering under this blockade due to a lack of medicine, fuel, food, and more coming into the country, and it's mighty convenient for American politicians to implement a suffocating blockade that stops necessary goods from coming into the country and then blame that deficit of goods on socialism. The point of the blockade is cruelty, and any U.S. president has no right to talk about democracy or sovereignty or freedom or human rights as long as they support the blockade on Cuba. Code Pink calls for the immediate lifting of the blockade and a removal of Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. Thank you.
Thank you, Danica. So our next speaker is Pastor Dan Dale. He's a representative of the Chicago Religious Leadership Network. The CRLN has been active here in Chicago for decades, getting out the word about the progress that's been made in Cuba, organizing cultural exchanges and visits for Americans to go see for themselves the situation in Cuba. So we're proud to have Pastor Dan Dale here.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for being here on this occasion of the 31st vote in the United States, in the UN, to condemn the United States for its inhumane, unjust, and cruel embargo against Cuba. And for over three decades, the world has been demanding that the U.S. end its embargo of Cuba. Again, my name is Dan Dale, and I am a former board member of the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America, also a former board member of Pastors for Peace, who has spent a lot of time working in Cuba as well. CRLN, with our faith partners in Cuba, has been calling and struggling for an end to the U.S. embargo, the U.S. blockade against Cuba since the 90s. We joined faith leaders around the world in calling for an end to the U.S. blockade. The World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches, and most of the national denominational structures have all called for an end to the U.S. blockade of Cuba for decades. Since the 90s, CRLN has taken delegations to Cuba to see the reality of the life in Cuba, the wonderful achievements of the revolution, and to see the harm and cruelty caused by the embargo against the Cuban people. We have also hosted delegations of religious leaders from Cuba here in Chicago and throughout the United States. One of the religious leaders from Cuba that I had the privilege of hosting in my home, Clara Rodes, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Havana, amazing woman, pastor, and eloquent spokesperson for Cuban sovereignty and the rights of the Cuban people to determine their own future. It was a privilege to see her in Cuba at Ebenezer Baptist Church and to host her in my home. A few years after she was in my home, she needed an organ transplant, and she had a successful operation, but the medicine that was needed for her her body to adapt to her organ was unavailable because of the U.S. embargo, and she died.
Right.
My friend, my colleague, Clara, was murdered by my government. Her death is a direct result of our government refusing to allow the Cuban people to determine their own destiny, to have access to medicine, to all of the things that they need to build their economy. So neither I nor CRLN will ever stop struggling to end this immoral, inhuman, cruel blockade of Cuba. Clara Rodes, presente.
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 Thank you very much, Dan, for those moving comments. That we all share your grief, and we all express our solidarity with the people of Cuba who are suffering under this brutal blockade. One of the organizations who's fought for many years to stop this cruel and barbarous blockade has been the Socialist Workers' Party. We're proud today to have a representative, Naomi Crane, that she is running for the United States Congress to put the voice of the working people into the Congress so we can stand up and we can have our opinions expressed in our government. I'd like to welcome Naomi Crane.
Thank you, Mark. The Socialist Workers' Party joins with all those here, around the country and around the world in calling for an end to all U.S. sanctions against Cuba, take Cuba off the outrageous and hypocritical state-sponsored terrorism list, lift all of the travel restrictions, and for the U.S. to get out of Guantanamo, which is sovereign Cuban territory that they have occupied against the wishes of the Cuban people. As others have said, this is a brutal policy. It's been carried out for over 60 years under 13 different U.S. administrations, Democratic and policy has been carried out for over 60 years under 13 different administrations, Democratic and Republican alike. Its aim is to cause pain and suffering of Cuban workers and farmers as punishment for having the audacity to make a socialist revolution. In April 1960, a State Department memo said acknowledged that the majority of Cubans support the revolution. And therefore, it said the U.S. policy should deny, quote, money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of the government. And while they haven't achieved that, they continue on that policy today with the same aims. Why? Because they see the Cuban Revolution as dangerous, not in any military sense, but its example. They're determined to bury it in lies and smother any interest. The same way they lie about every time working people here stand up and fight. The way they lied about what the issues for the United Auto Workers were, that they were being greedy, or many others. And there is more resistance and working people looking to stand up and fight today. You know, you see it from the auto workers to UPS workers to, I work on the railroad in the conductors union, the fight that we wanted to wage last year, you know, and what all the Democrats and Republicans, besides the embargo, the other thing they agreed on was banning the rail workers from going on strike. What about this example is so dangerous? It's the fact that the example that with leadership, ordinary workers and farmers are capable of taking power, are capable of ending the dictatorship of capital that we live under, are capable of beginning to build a society based on human needs and solidarity, and not dog-eat-dog drive for profits that capitalism is imposing and that is deepening crises around the world. They give the example of real internationalism, from the hundreds of thousands of Cubans that volunteered and fought in Angola to defeat the South African apartheid army, to the volunteers who've gone as doctors, teachers, and other in solidarity and collaboration around the world. And they've set an example that no crimes be committed in the name of the revolution. There is nothing more slanderous than the U.S. government's claim that Cuba is a state sponsor of terror. It's the absolute opposite. The entire record of the Cuban Revolution speaks to that. This is the example that Washington seeks to destroy. And it's in the interest of working people here and our unions to join in the fight to demand take Cuba off the terror list, end the embargo now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Naomi. Naomi talked about the response of the American labor movement to the revolution in Cuba and how much they expressed their solidarity with the workers in Cuba. So our next speaker is Bill Beaulieu, who is a official from the National Association of Letter Carriers, and his union has been involved in this struggle for a long time. So I'd like to invite Bill to have a few words.
Hey everybody. I am not currently I have a position in the National Association of Letter Carriers, but I was a representative for 33 years, fighting with management. Naomi talked about solidarity. Unions are the only way we have of fighting back against capitalists, and that is why our society fights so hard against unions. In Cuba, 98% of the workers are unionized. In the U.S., it's a tiny bit over 10%. And most of that 10% is in the public sector, federal, state, and local government unions. In the U.S., businesses spend nearly $400 million a year on union busting, using firms, including a number in Chicago, that specialize in that. They teach companies how to not have unions. They teach companies how to keep taking advantage of their workers. But let me deviate a little bit and say that I think it's ironic that the U.S., which is a principal sponsor of state terror in this world, would denote anybody else as a state sponsor of terrorism. What is happening in Cuba is happening and has been happening because they dared to throw off the capitalists who were oppressing them. And like Haiti 200 years before them, they have to be punished. And they will be punished. And the world does nothing. As far as workers' rights, The fact that only 10% of American workers are unionized means 89% of American workers have no voice. They can beg, but they cannot bargain, and they cannot demand. And that is why we have such wage inequality, and that is why we have such social stress right now. It isn't people are lazy, it isn't times are hard. It's the richest 1% have far more than they're ever going to need, and they do not want to give it up. And unions are the only way to deal with that. Cuba understands that. That's why Cuban workers are unionized. That's why they get 30 days of vacation a year guaranteed. That's why they have family leave, maternity leave, things that most American workers do not have. The average American worker gets 10 days of vacation a year. Think about that. And that is why we've got to stand with Cuba, and that's why we've got to learn from Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. There were a number of speakers who had volunteered to come and join us and express their solidarity today, who were not able to make it. Alderman Byron Sicha-Lopez from the 25th Ward had agreed to speak. Professor Cristina Perez, the program director of Latin American Studies and Women and Gender at Dominican University, had also agreed to come, and unfortunately she's sick today, but she was just instrumental just in the last 2 weeks of having hosting a visit from a Cuban journalist, Liz Oliva Fernandez, who made many public appearances here in Chicago to talk about the blockade of Cuba and the emotional, physical, economic stress that's caused. We also have greetings from John Colley. John is a member of the Service Employees International Union, working with their healthcare unit, and he took the time to send a message of solidarity, so I'll read that right now. John says, "Hello everyone, my name is John Colley, and I am a member and leader with the SEIU Healthcare Indiana, Illinois. I want to make a brief statement. We live in the United States of America, and our country is supposed to be a bastion of freedom and justice, the example of what democracy is to the world. How can we call ourselves by these titles with the injustice we are perpetrating against our brothers and sisters in Cuba? I am 47 years old, and the embargo has been going on my entire life, and most of my mother's life. She was 11 years old when it went into effect. So, for 3 or 4 generations, we as a country have been starving, holding back medical and humanitarian needs, and trying to impoverish an entire group of people. These are not the actions of a country that is a, quote, bastion of freedom and justice, unquote. It is time to live out the slogans and release the embargo on the Cuban people so that we can live our ideals." Woo! Thank you, John. One of the other items that's going on is that we are in the process here at the Chicago Cuba Coalition of collecting 1 million signatures on a nationwide campaign to call on our U.S. government to end the blockade. So if you have not already signed the petition, we have some here today. Julie has them. She's the lady with the red beret on. So please stop and talk to Julie and put your signature on there and take your stand to end the blockade of Cuba. So at this time, unless somebody else has something they want to add to our wonderful speakers that we had, we're going to close with a chant. Let Cuba live! 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 Let Cuba live!
Let Cuba live!